Hey everybody, welcome to the HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com podcast. I am your host, David Vignola, and this week we're going to talk about 3 tips to getting a great sounding bass to sit in your mix. If you struggle with getting the bass to sound good in your mix, and this podcast is for you. We're also going to answer a couple of questions from this week's mailbag, and then at the end of the show, I'm going to give you a couple of free gifts. So not only make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a fabulous review on this podcast, but make sure you stick around to the end of the episode because I want to give you a couple of free gifts. It's my way of saying thank you for sticking around and listening to this episode. So now let's talk about 3 great tips to getting a great sounding bass in your mix right here on the HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com podcast. Okay, welcome everyone. This is episode 3, and if you've been sticking around and been listening to episode 1, 2, and you've come back for episode 3, I want to first and foremost, thank you very much for giving this podcast a chance. We're brand new here, and every week I'm trying to make the episodes better and better, so I hope you're enjoying them thus far. And don't forget to leave a nice review on your podcast, wherever you're consuming this podcast. Leave a nice review. Give me the old thumbs up, like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. So now let's talk about the 3 tips to getting a great bass sound in your mix. So if you've ever struggled with getting your bass and your mix to sit consistently, where things don't sound too muddy, they don't sound too boomy, they don't sound too thin, or they just don't cut through the mix, if you have these problems from time to time, and we've all had them at one point or another, then these 3 tips I think are going to point you in the right direction. Now, there are many more than 3 that we can talk about, but these are 3 that I find that work more times than not. So the first tip number 1, is don't be afraid to use a small amount of distortion and or chorus on your bass track to help it cut through the mix, especially distortion. So you could do this one of 2 ways. You can have your original bass track and you can use a distortion plugin on your bass track itself. You can use a stock distortion plugin if your DAW comes with one, or there are a couple of third-party ones I really enjoy. In particular would be the Devilox Deluxe by the company Sound Toys, as well as the Decapitator by Sound Toys are 2 of my favorites. But again, you can really use any old distortion plugin. You can just put it right as the first insert on your bass track. You can try that, or you can copy your bass track and make a duplicate track, and you can put it on that track and maybe do it a little bit heavier, and then you can blend the 2 faders between the 2 tracks together to give you the appropriate amount of distortion that you need to get it to cut through. Now, again, doing it in solo so you can hear the distortion is one thing, but you always want to do this in the context of the mix. You'll find a little bit of a distortion will go a long way. Even in styles of music where you wouldn't think a gritty sounding bass would really be appropriate, you want to make it so it isn't really obvious that the bass is quote unquote distorted, but it just helps it give it that little bit of crispiness on the top end frequencies to get it to cut through the mix. So try that. Another thing you can also try, as I said, is you can send that bass track to a chorus effect as well. Again, a little bit of chorus will thicken it up a little bit, and that'll get it to, if you have a real thin sounding bass in particularly, that will help it not only cut through the mix, but give it a little bit fatter sound, a little bit thicker sound, or you can use distortion and chorus together. So try small amounts of distortion, small amounts of chorusing, either on the original track or copy and paste the track and duplicate the track and try it that way. That will really help. You'd be surprised how a little will go a long way. Tip number 2 is a little bit more of an advanced technique, and really have to be able to understand and have tuned your ear into using a compressor. But if you have done that and you are good with a compressor, then play a lot with the attack settings on a compressor. Okay, and you may say, well, what do you mean by that? So if your bass track sounds a little too or lacks, I should say, if your bass track lacks some punch, then go with a slower attack on your compressor. The slower attack is going to allow that first transient to pop through the mix a little bit more. And usually the 1 count of, in musical speak, on the 1 is usually where that bass note kind of pops through a lot and really gets the thing to sit nicely. So by using a slower attack, you're going to let the transient squeeze through a little bit more. It's going to give the bass a little bit thicker sound, going to have a little bit more punch, and it's going to cut through a little bit more. Now, conversely, if the bass is too boomy, or if the one is poking through way too much, then you may want to use a faster attack, and that's going to clamp down on that transient a little bit more aggressively. Therefore, it's going to soften the bass a little bit, and it's going to get it to sit back a little bit in the mix, and it's not going to be so in your face. So by using attack time on a compressor, you can really change the way the bass kind of sounds. And again, I always say on a bass, especially if the bass player is playing with their fingers and not a pick, or unless they're if they're a real pro player and can play super consistently, that's great. But a lot of bass players cannot do that, and so therefore the one count is always the note that kind of sticks through and kind of jumps out at you, and it can be very boomy, very annoying, very distracting. So using attack times on a compressor is going to help it make the bass sit a little bit better in the mix. So try that. And if you're struggling to hear compression, and you say, Dave, no matter how much I turn that attack setting, I really don't hear much of a difference, and you just struggle with the whole concept of compression, then I would highly recommend you check out the course at homerecordingmadeeasy.com called Compression Made Easy. I'll leave a link in the description box below in the show notes so you can check that out. That's great for beginners and intermediates that struggle with the whole concept of compression, and most importantly, how to hear compression and what to listen for. And that will really help you when you try to add this little tip here using the attack settings on your bass. Understanding and being able to hear compression is a key factor in all of that, okay? So Compression Made Easy, again, link will be in the show notes below. And the last tip I have is don't be afraid to be aggressive with EQ on a bass, which is a little bit counterintuitive to what I normally teach with EQ. I always talk about doing things subtle, doing things in a very gentle way. Don't do any major cuts or boosts. You typically don't need to do that. You don't want to make things sound too harsh or too boomy or too thin or too muddy. Be more gentle with EQ curves in general. But on a bass guitar, you can be really aggressive with an EQ to get it to sit right and cut through the mix. I mean, there's been times where I've gone ahead and I've did massive cuts at the 250 hertz range to get things to not sound so boomy or so muddy or have that really weird ringing out frequency. And at the same time, I would boost 700 hertz or 1K to get the fingers to kind of pop more so I could hear the bass a little bit more in the mix. So don't be afraid to be aggressive with EQ, but here's the caveat. You want to make sure you do that while you're listening to the entire mix, so you do that within the context of a mix. And we've talked about that on the Home Recording Made Easy YouTube channel for years and years, and I've already mentioned it a couple of times in the last couple of podcast episodes. You want to do things in the context of a mix as much as possible. And when you're doing that with your EQ and you're making some of these aggressive moves, you could get that bass to sit just perfectly in the mix. And it really all depends on how the bass was recorded, how all the other instruments were recorded around it, what style of music, and how it all kind of fits together as a puzzle. So again, don't be afraid to be aggressive with EQ, but always do it in the context of a mix. And that'll also help you get that bass track to sit nice in your mix. So those are 3 tips that you can try right away, and a lot of times that'll solve most of your problems. And again, in future episodes, we may talk about some more things that you can try, but those are 3 that I use all the time. And I'd say probably 85% of the time, 90% of the time, it gets the bass to sit right where I want it. So now I want to take us on over to our next segment that I call the mailbag. Let's answer a couple of questions that came in last week. So let's jump on into the mailbag. Okay, on this week's mailbag segment, we're going to answer 2 questions. The first question comes in from Shane Codwell. Shane, how are you? Thanks for writing in. He writes in, hey Dave, what is your opinion on using bass amp sim plugins? Do you feel it's better to mic a real amp cab or use a plugin? Just curious on your thoughts. Thanks, Shane. Well, Shane, thank you for writing in. Bass amp simulator plugins, VST bass plugins, I think are great. I mean, unlike guitar amp sim plugins, which is only a few that I really think that are great, that sound real enough that it can maybe replace a real guitar amp. We'll talk about that in a future episode here. But for bass cabinets and bass amps in general, I find a lot of them are very good. I mean, I use the Universal Audio bass plugins. They're great. I've used the Softtube stuff. I've used the bass amp sims from Brainworks and Plugin Alliance, and I'm sure there are others. And actually, I've even used the bass amp sim plugin Ampire in the PreSonus Studio One DAW, and their bass preset sounds great too. So I'm not opposed to to bass amp sim plugins. I think they sound great. You'll have to just do some experimentation. Miking a real amp is great as well. It's a lot more involved, but depending on the amp in the cabinet, that could be a great way too. And then sometimes I've used the real mic, and I've also used the DI track where maybe we just plugged the bass directly into the console and recorded it that way with no sim plugin and no bass amp, and use that as well and blended the two tracks together. So there are several ways to do it. But the short answer is, I think bass amp sim plugins are just fine. They sound very, very realistic. Go out and demo a few of them and see what you like, but I think they're great. So I wouldn't hesitate to use them, and I use them all the time. So thanks so much, Shane, for writing in. Question number 2 comes from Richard, and Richard writes in, hi, Dave. If you're going to mic up a bass amp, what mic would you recommend? I've heard that using a kick drum mic is the way to go, but I thought I would ask your opinion. Thanks, Richard. Richard, thank you so much for writing in. Yeah, usually I would say use like a kick drum mic, something like an Audix, what's a D112, or the Shure Beta 52 is another great one. Those tend to be made to accept the real low end frequencies that like a kick drum and like a bass guitar will kind of pump out. So that's always good. You won't distort the capsule nearly as easily. And then again, I've also mic'd up a bass cab with an SM57. We talked a little bit earlier in this episode about how to get the bass to cut through the mix. And if you want some of that crispiness on the top to get it to poke through, you'll use a distortion plugin. Well, sometimes using an SM57 dynamic microphone and a bass cab will give you some of that little gnarly sound that you can use to blend with maybe a DI track or even blend with a bass amp sim plugin like we talked about a few minutes ago. And the blending of those two things will give you just enough of the low end and some of that not nasty, but that sizzle stuff on the top end to get the bass to cut through the mix. So yeah, I would experiment, but I would say generally speaking, I would use a kick drum mic or like a floor tom mic, something like that, like the Audix D2 comes to mind as well. Those are microphones that I would check out as well, and that's how I would typically do it. But don't be afraid to experiment because you never know what kind of sounds you can get, and the more options you have in mixing in that respect, especially with bass guitar, I find the better. So thank you so much, Richard, for writing in. And that is it for this week's mailbag segment. So now you've listened to the whole episode, and I so appreciate you've listened to the entire episode. And I want to give you a couple of free gifts. Now, first and foremost, I'd love for you to do me a favor, wherever you're consuming and listening to this podcast, if you give me the thumbs up and give me a nice, excellent review or 5-star review, I would really appreciate it. It really helps me. If you're enjoying this podcast on any level and you're getting some valuable information, any positive feedback you can give me would be great. Also, I'd love to know what your ideas are for future show episodes, so make sure you comment and let me know as well. That would be fantastic. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, and give me a review if you would. Now, if this is your first time here at Home Recording Made Easy Podcast and you don't know what Home Recording Made Easy is, I want to welcome you to the homerecordingmadeeasy.com family, and I want to give you a gift. I want to give you 5 free mixing training courses worth about $200 over at homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Again, all the links will be in the description box below in the show notes. Go to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Right on the homepage, there's a big orange button. You can't miss it. Get your 5 free courses. Click on that button, get your 5 free courses. You can learn how to mix, get all the audio files and all the training videos. It's a really cool thing. Go get it today, 5 free mixing training courses. Now, I also want to give you a coupon code because you listened to this entire podcast episode, and I greatly appreciate it. The coupon code is podcast30. Again, it'll be in the show notes below. Podcast30. You can use that at checkout and get any course at homerecordingmadeeasy.com at 30% off. Okay, one-time 30% discount on any course. If you want to check out Compression Made Easy, as I mentioned a little earlier in this episode, that's on homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Use podcast30. Get 30% off today. And last but certainly not least, if you really enjoy the craft of mixing, we're talking about mixing bass this week. We've talked about a couple of mixing techniques in the podcast thus far. And you really enjoy the craft of mixing and you want to learn mixing, you want to dive down deep into the details, and you want to get the best mixes possible out of your music in your home studio, then I invite you to check out what I have going on over at mixingmadeeasy.net. Once again, the links will be in the show notes below. Check out mixingmadeeasy.net. It's a mixing membership website where every month we get a new song. You get all the audio files and you get between 4 and 6 hours of video training, and you watch me mix a song from start to finish in real time, and you get to mix the song along with me. We do different styles of music. We use different plugins, different mixing concepts and techniques every single month. And the best thing about it, it'll cost you less than 50 cents a day. What? 50 cents a day. Less than a small cup of coffee every single day. You will be able to take your mixes from demo to pro level in less than 6 months' time if you apply the training. I absolutely guarantee it. So check out mixingmadeeasy.net. So once again, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I look forward to seeing you next week so we could talk about everything studio gear related, mixing, mastering, recording, so on and so forth. And until next week, I've been Dave with homerecordingmadeeasy.com and mixingmadeeasy.net. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you next week. Take care.